Welcome to EXS 408 in the first lecture on metabolism from Chapter 1 in the McCardle Catch and Catch textbook. Our primary objective for this slide deck is to recall basic functions of carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins, discuss a little bit about how diet can impact performance and impact these macronutrient levels, specifically carbohydrates, and then sort of explore their energy content, and then most importantly, your objective or study question after completing this presentation is to identify how fuel utilization changes in exercise. And there's two examples I want to just quickly sketch. We want to be able to understand how utilization on the y-axis changes in fuels over time. So I want to see if I continue to exercise for 4 or 5 hours, so continuous aerobic exercise, what's going to happen to carbohydrate utilization as an energy source? Is it going to go down? Is it going to go up? What's the relationship with exercise and duration in terms of how I utilize fuel? I also want to look at, instead of time, I want to look at fuel utilization versus intensity of the activity. So is the relationship the same or different if I change the exercise intensity? So if I continue to exercise at increasing higher levels of intensity, how does that change fuel utilization? So these terms you should be familiar with. Glycolysis, glyco for glucose, lysis for the breakdown of glucose, glycogenolysis, the breakdown of glycogen, and gluconeogenesis, the synthesis of glucose from non-glucose precursors, with the example being amino acids. Now, recall that the carbohydrate is stored in the body in 3 locations: in the blood as glucose, in the liver as glycogen, and in skeletal muscle as glycogen. It's our primary energy source in terms of immediate energy that's easily accessible and available with inside skeletal muscle for activity. It's also a fuel for our central nervous system, and we can convert it to fat if we consume excess carbohydrates than required. Notice in the graph that predominantly our glycogen stores are greater in skeletal muscle than they are in the liver. So let's take a look at how carbohydrate intake in your diet can impact muscle glycogen stores and then change performance. So if you look on the x-axis of this graph, this is initial muscle glycogen content measured as grams of glycogen per 100 grams of muscle tissue. If you consume a high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet, when you perform an exercise test, the time to exhaustion, typically these are done on cycles, so you cycle for as long as you can at a submaximal intensity. You can clearly see that when you're on a high carbohydrate, low fat diet, muscle glycogen stores are quite high, meaning you have a greater availability of fuel source. So your time to exhaustion is much longer than if you were to consume a high fat, low carbohydrate diet. Essentially, if you do not consume adequate amounts of carbohydrate in your diet, you will negatively impact your glycogen stores, which will then negatively impact endurance exercise performance. The question is, why is that? Well, recall that carbohydrate is a quick and easy accessible source of energy that you can convert to ATP through glycolysis. That pathway produces a high amount of ATP per unit of time, which is beneficial. If you were to deplete your glycogen stores, your body would now have to rely more on free fatty acids or triglycerides or fat as a fuel source as opposed to carbohydrates, and that can be problematic. So if we examine carbohydrate dynamics during exercise, carbohydrate utilization essentially is controlled via intensity. So the greater the intensity of the exercise, the greater the reliance on carbohydrates. When we look at carbohydrates utilization during exercise, we oftentimes examine a graph that depicts carbohydrate utilization in terms of utilization of fuel source over intensity. So if carbohydrate utilization is in blue, as we increase exercise intensity, we see an increase in carb utilization. We also see a decrease in fat utilization. So essentially, this graph is showing us that with increased exercise intensity, you rely more on carbohydrates and less on lipids or fats. Now, the reason this becomes important is primarily for a couple of factors. One, when we need energy right away, at higher intensities, we have a greater reliance on energy or ATP. So the easiest way to access energy is to tap into our muscle glycogen stores, as opposed to tapping into subcutaneous fat tissue, because that energy has to be mobilized and taken from our adipose tissue cells and then into our blood system and then uptaken into skeletal muscle. The reason this becomes even more interesting and important is when you look at energy in terms of what exercise intensity zone you're looking at. So if you take a look at this example of exercising at two different heart rates, if you exercise at 85%, you're going to be relying almost on an 80% carbohydrate utilization, whereas if you were exercising at 55% of your max heart rate, you may be relying on more of a 60% utilization from fat and a 40% utilization of carbohydrates. So if you exercise at 55% of heart rate max and you expend 209 calories, if you take that percentage of 121, it's roughly around a little more than 50% of your total energy expenditure you can attribute to utilizing fat as a fuel source. But if you work out just a little bit harder, for the same period of time, you expend more calories, and even though the percentage of fat utilization at higher intensity is lower, because you've expended a greater amount of calories, in total, that means your percentage, while smaller, still results in a higher expenditure of fat calories. So now, if you see this typical heart rate zone example that you would find on some treadmills and other posters, the idea of a fat burning zone really is a misnomer. The idea behind looking at this graph and saying that there's a fat burning zone or an ideal heart rate where you're going to optimize fat as an energy source, technically it's true. At lower intensities, you will see a greater reliance on fat. But just simply by examining energy expenditure, you can see that exercising at higher intensity is possible to utilize a higher energy expenditure or calorie expenditure of fat metabolism. So ultimately, this chart or graph is not useful in terms of dictating what exercise intensity you should be at for optimal fat burning. So one of the common graphs that you find in textbooks that you're going to want to be familiar with is simply drawing the crossover concept. And the crossover concept indicates that if we were to draw a graph and label our x-axis as intensity and our y-axis as percent fuel utilization, we would expect to see as you increase exercise intensity, carbohydrate utilization goes up. If we were to draw fat utilization as increases in exercise intensity, fat utilization would go down as you increased exercise intensity. And the crossover concept indicates at some point you have a crossover between these 2 points where you've got a 50-50 mixture. Now, what's more important to understand for the purposes of exercise physiology, in my opinion, is why we see these fuel changes, and we're going to discuss that as we go on through the rest of this lecture. So if we look at a figure from your textbook on carbohydrate dynamics during exercise, you can look at this graph and see exercise duration on the x-axis in minutes, and then leg glucose uptake as a rate of millimoles of glucose per minute on the y-axis. And you can see in intense exercise in the yellow line a much greater demand for blood glucose and glucose used as a fuel source as compared to mild exercise. So during heavy intense exercise, you can deplete your liver glycogen stores in about 2 hours, whereas in an hour you can deplete glycogen stores by half. In moderate, prolonged duration exercise, fat will serve as the main energy source if the intensity is low. Okay. You're going to want to spend some time looking at these 4 graphs. On the x-axis is exercise time, so it's a 2-hour exercise bout, and then each of the 4 graphs indicates A for carbohydrate, B for fat utilization, C for protein utilization, and D for their exercise intensity. I'm not going to go over all of these graphs in this slide presentation because I want you to spend some time interpreting what you're seeing. If we start with the A graph, you can see that the carbohydrate-loaded person is increasing carbohydrate utilization as they complete the 2-hour exercise bout, whereas the red line indicates in a carbohydrate-depleted individual where they have substantially less glycogen stores, their carb utilization is going down over the course of the 2 hours. If we examine the D graph, you can see that the carbohydrate-depleted person is unable to maintain their exercise intensity over the course of 2 hours. And this is primarily because they are lacking in carbohydrate stores. So I leave it to you to interpret the B graph of fat utilization differences between being carbohydrate-loaded and carbohydrate-depleted, and also to examine the C graph, which looks at protein use as a fuel source. Later in the semester, we will discuss the endocrine system, but just generally speaking, for carbohydrate dynamics during exercise, the sympathetic nervous system will stimulate the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine, which will promote the breakdown of glycogen. Glucagon also has an effect that is secreted from your pancreas, and insulin is an antagonistic hormone to glucagon. So glucagon levels will rise to promote glycogen breakdown. Insulin will be inhibited so that it does not have that effect. Insulin is an anabolic hormone that would promote the storage of carbohydrate. So now we'll transition over to lipids. Recall that lipids are an energy source. They contain a high amount of energy per gram. So a gram of fat contains 9 kcals, whereas a gram of carbohydrate only contains 4. Fat is useful for carrying vitamins, it's useful for insulation, it's useful for protecting vital organs, and it's very easily stored in our body. If you were to look at the energy content, if you recall the amount of calories we store as carbohydrate, which is roughly around 2,000, look at the total storage of adipose tissue. Now this is just in a typical 70 kilogram human. 12,000 grams of adipose tissue over 110,000 kcals. Now that's quite a difference compared to the 2,000 kcals of storage of carbohydrate. Here is an example of fat dynamics during exercise. Recall that the respiratory quotient, or RQ, indicates carbohydrate production divided by oxygen utilization. So it's a ratio of the amount of carbon dioxide you're producing divided by the amount of oxygen you're consuming. And typically when we have a respiratory quotient value of 0.7, that indicates that fat is the dominant fuel source. And now I drew a graph earlier with exercise intensity on the x-axis. This graph is showing exercise duration. So now you see an inverse relationship. The percentage of total energy on the y-axis is showing you that as you increase the duration of exercise at a similar or moderate intensity, you rely more on fat as a fuel source as opposed to carbohydrate. Make sure that you can differentiate between increasing exercise intensity and that's effect on fuel utilization versus simply exercising for a prolonged period of time. Duration versus intensity is much different in terms of fuel utilization. I like this graph. I thought it was very interesting when I discovered this study in grad school because it shows you how fuel utilization changes over the duration of exercise. So this is just another graph looking at what percentage of oxygen consumption is coming from, in blue, intramuscular glycogen, fats, and proteins, so fuel inside the muscle, versus free fatty acids in yellow, so that would be essentially your adipose tissue, because you have to break down the fat, transport it out of your subcutaneous adipose tissue, and transport it into the muscle to be used as a fuel source. And then the purple box would be just blood glucose, and that's essentially going to come from liver glycogen or circulating glucose. So now we sort of revisit the idea that we use different fuel sources based on the intensity we exercise at. And this is a great cycling study where they were able to label and measure fuel coming from muscle glycogen in the sea blue, muscle fats in the dark blue, purple being plasma-free fatty acids, and then orange being glucose. And basically you can see what's happening as exercise intensity increases. See the sea blue color, the increase in reliance on muscle glycogen, whereas triacylglycerol as an energy source diminishes, as well as plasma-free fatty acids. So this study was sort of implying that at 65% you had a greater use or fuel from free fatty acids, so it would be indicative of potentially training at that intensity. But recall again, the best intensity for fat loss, while you could certainly find an intensity that has the highest utilization of fat as a fuel source, it doesn't necessarily equate to a greater energy expenditure. And ultimately, if you were to explore the best exercise intensity for fat loss, I would argue that an exercise intensity and type that your client or individual is going to perform is something that they can continue to do without stopping, so that they could adhere to the exercise program as opposed to trying to find the best way to expend energy from fat. If you look at just regular training and fat utilization, what essentially happens is you are able to utilize fat as a fuel source much more effectively in a trained rather than an untrained state. So typically if you were to complete 12 weeks of aerobic endurance training, you would see that before training you're using about 60% carbohydrates at a submaximal intensity, and after training that has reduced greatly to about 40%. And essentially what's happening is your skeletal muscle is becoming more oxidative in nature. It's increasing its oxidative capacity to use fat as a fuel source and not rely on carbohydrate as much. So now we're going to transition over to protein. If we look at protein, primarily we're essentially looking at our major sources of protein being in the blood plasma itself or in visceral tissue, and then also in overall muscle throughout the body. Some of the concerns with protein metabolism is that you have to remove a nitrogen group through deamination. This then forms urea, which is a metabolic waste product and something that we need to eliminate. So we do this via the kidneys. And when you break down amino acids and remove that nitrogen group, you then have created a skeleton of carbon molecules so that you could either synthesize glucose, use it as an energy source, or even synthesize triglyceride. I just want to point this out in terms of where amino acids can be utilized. This is the citric acid cycle, or the Krebs cycle. This is an aerobic pathway, and essentially you can see that the cycle is a circle, and individual amino acids can enter this cycle in order to essentially be used as energy. So, for example, isoleucine and leucine can be converted to acetyl-CoA, which is a common pathway intermediate going from glycolysis into the citric acid cycle. So we will talk more about this in the next slide deck when we go over the energy systems. It's important to note that the body transitions between periods of protein synthesis as well as protein breakdown. And this is essentially nitrogen balance. The idea that typically during exercise we're seeing an increase in protein breakdown, and when exercise is completed, we then start to see a changeover to an increase in protein synthesis. So just important to recall that the body is in constant turnover, and we would experience different rates of synthesis and breakdown depending on physical activity or recovery status. Recall earlier in this lecture we discussed that protein can be used as a fuel source, but it's especially used as a fuel source in this graph example when your carbohydrate stores are depleted. And you can see that here on the C graph, that in the red line, that is an increase in protein utilization in an individual who is glycogen depleted over the course of 2 hours of moderate intensity exercise. Whereas the yellow line of the carbohydrate-loaded individual sees a slight uptick in protein utilization, but it is minimal. The body prefers to spare its protein pool if possible. I just want to conclude with one example of the alanine-glucose cycle, just to show you how alanine can be converted to glucose in the liver. That glucose can then be delivered to skeletal muscle where it can be used immediately as a fuel source. So this is just one example of how we would use an amino acid to maintain blood glucose levels in the absence or depletion of glycogen storage. This concludes the lecture for slide deck 1 and metabolism.